Okay, Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh, and good evening to everyone watching this webinar organized by the Hashim Sani Center for Palestine Studies at the University of Malaya, Kuala Lumpur. My name is Nazar Ismail, and I'm the center's director. On 20th June, a very large group of armed Israeli settlers attacked a Palestinian town called Turmis Aya in the occupied West Bank, setting fire to homes, cars, and fields in a revenge rampage that left one Palestinian dead from gunfire and 10 others injured. The Palestinian who was murdered, his name is Omar Abu Katan, and he was just 27 years old. He was shot by Israeli soldiers who entered after the Palestinians tried to defend themselves from the attacks by the settlers. Many Palestinians were injured by live shots, some fired by soldiers and others by settlers. About 30 houses and over 40 cars were burned. By the way, this is not the first time Jewish settlers attack Palestinian villages in the West Bank. Before this, I think it was in February, they attacked the town of Huwara, also in the West Bank. Hundreds of settlers burned houses and cars. These settlers are protected by the Israeli army. And the Palestinians are not allowed to defend themselves, neither with the help of the Palestinian security forces, nor by establishing their own national guard. So now it is evident to the world that if you live in the West Bank, your life and property will be protected only if you are Jewish. If you are not Jewish, you can be shot dead, your properties can be burned down, and nothing will happen to those who commit those crimes. Moreover, settlement construction has continued under every Israeli government over the past decades. More than 400,000 Israeli settlers now live in the West Bank, alongside almost 3 million Palestinians. Some of the settlements are home to religious Zionists who believe that the area is their biblical birthright. According to an Israeli newspaper, an Israeli cabinet minister, his name Bezalel Smotrich, he is in charge of settlement construction. He has instructed ministries in Israel to prepare to improve the infrastructure in the settlement areas of the West Bank to absorb another 500,000 settlers. So with all these developments, you cannot help but wonder, why are people still discussing the two-state solution? It is obvious that Israel is not interested at all in the idea. It seems they want all of Palestine for themselves. But nevertheless, even until today, the international community seems to be fixated on the idea that peace in the Middle East can only be obtained through the framework of the two-state solution. It must also be borne in mind that Palestine was formerly inhabited by Arabs for thousands of years before European Jews came to the land beginning in the late 19th century. These immigrants decided to establish another state on hitherto Arab lands. So even the idea of a two-state solution seems unfair to the Palestinians. So why does the international community insist that this unfair framework is the key to achieving peace in the Middle East? To explain the issue further, including how this idea of the two-state solution came about and whether it is still viable, we are very fortunate to have an authority on the subject matter with us today, Dr. Azzam Tamimi. Welcome to the webinar, Dr. Azzam. Please allow me to introduce you to our viewers. Dr. Azzam Tamimi is a British-Palestinian writer, analyst, and commentator. He obtained his doctorate in political philosophy from the University of Westminster in London in 1998. Until 2008, he was the director of the London-based Institute of Islamic Political Thought. From September 2000 to 30th March 2004, he worked as a senior lecturer at the Markby Institute of Higher Education in Leicestershire, UK. Between 2004 and 2006, he was a visiting professor at Kyoto and Nagoya universities in Japan, In July 2006, he co-founded the London-based Al Hiwa Arabic satellite TV channel. He writes and lectures on issues related to Islamic political thought and Middle Eastern politics. And his books, he has written a number of books, and including Power Sharing in Islam, Islam and Secularism in the Middle East, Rashid Ghanouchi, a Democrat within Islamism, and a very interesting book called Hamas Unwritten Chapters, published by Hearst, London in 2006. And it has been updated and published in 2007 in the US. So without further ado, the floor is yours, Dr. Azzam. Go ahead.
Jazakallah khairan, Professor Nazari. It's really a pleasure, and thank you for inviting me and arranging this talk or seminar, whatever one might call it. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, alhamdulillah, salatu wassalamu ala rasulillah wa ala alihi wa man wala. The idea of a two-state solution is not really a new idea. It goes back to 1947, when the international community, or the United Nations at the time, came up with the partition resolution, a resolution that suggested splitting Palestine between the Jews and the Arabs. Although at the time, the Arabs were still the majority inhabitants. And actually only a couple of decades earlier, the Jews were no more than 10% of the total population, to whom no more than 2 to 3% of the land belonged. Yet the two-state solution is something that emanates from an international will to empower the nascent Jewish state that was created on this land in the very heart of the Arab and Muslim world. Of course, we don't have time to go through the details of the origins of this project, but this project, very briefly, finds its roots in Europe, which had a Jewish problem, couldn't resolve it, amounting to pogroms in Russia, to pogroms elsewhere, all the way to the Holocaust. And the Europeans, who managed to defeat the Ottoman Empire and divide part of its former territories among them, decided to enable the Zionist movement to establish a Jewish home in Palestine in order to resolve a problem that existed elsewhere in Europe, actually, because of anti-Semitism. Now, when people talk about the two-state solution, they do so because they feel that this is a status quo that cannot be changed. And I regret to say that with the passage of time, most Arab and Muslim countries have accepted this. They easily talk about a Palestinian state next to the Jewish state. The only people who reject this, actually, are the Palestinians themselves and the Zionists, because the Zionists, even though sometimes they claim they accept the two-state solution, in reality, in practice, on the ground, they don't allow for such an eventuality. For the Palestinians, as they rejected the partition in 1947, most of them continue to reject the idea of sharing their own ancestral homeland with those who came from Europe, stole it from them, and dispossessed them. However, as I said, with the passage of time, this has become a status quo that everybody wants to maintain. And the Arab changing circumstances led to this becoming an official Arab position, adopted by the Arab League, adopted by various Arab countries. And now they're begging the Israelis to allow a Palestinian state to emerge. Now, leaving the realpolitik on one side, let's talk about the reality on the ground. The reality on the ground is that successive Israeli governments, not only recent ones, but even the much earlier ones that were led by leftists, by Zionists from the Labour Party, took every measure at their disposal in order to block the way ahead of the establishment of a Palestinian state. And the most formidable obstacle is settlements, or is the settler movement. They grab the land, they build settlements on it, they grab more land in order to provide infrastructure, roads, and other facilities that are needed by the emerging Jewish communities, which mostly are constituted by those who come from far away, from Brooklyn in America, from Russia, from other countries, in pursuit of a dream, because they come here to this country, which provides them with all sorts of facilities under protection from a very strong army, as well as from the Arab protectors around them, because the real protection for Israel is really provided by Arab governments surrounding Palestine, occupied Palestine. Now, if you want to establish a Palestinian state next to a Jewish state, you'd have to have at least the West Bank free from every Jewish installation, every Jewish settlement. Yet this has become really impossible. Anybody who looks at today's map of the West Bank, you'll find that it is simply cut into pieces. Palestinian communities are imprisoned in enclaves here and there, surrounded by Jewish settlements or highways to provide services to these settlements all over the area. It was assumed in 1993, when the Oslo Accords were signed between the PLO and Israel, that the emerging Palestinian Authority, which is usually referred to as the PNA, Palestinian National Authority, would, with the passage of time, evolve into a Palestinian state in the West Bank and Gaza. But even since Oslo, the settlements continued to be built, existing settlements continued to grow, and Palestinians continued to lose more and more land. And most Palestinians will tell you now that they woke up to the nightmare of realizing that this Palestinian Authority was actually created for one purpose only: not Palestinian statehood, not Palestinian independence, not Palestinian sovereignty, but rather to provide security services to the Israeli occupation. And this is what they're doing. And therefore, even after Oslo, the prospects of a Palestinian state emerging next to a Jewish state within the borders of British Mandate Palestine are or have already really evaporated. Now, let's leave real politics aside, let's leave the reality aside, and talk about justice for the Palestinians. The two-state solution has really no way of delivering justice to the Palestinians. Take, for example, my mother's case. My mother, her parents, and her siblings used to live, she was born in a town called Bir Sheba, or Bir Saba in Arabic, which is in the Negev, Sahara al-Naqab, the Naqab Desert, or the Negev as it is called in English. And in 1948, they heard the news of the massacres that were perpetrated, especially in Deir Yassin, because the Zionists at the time were keen on allowing the news to spread, to frighten the rest of the population into fleeing their homes. So my mother and her family closed the door to their house, took a few precious things with them, left everything behind a closed door, and moved to Al-Khalil, or Hebron, the hometown of our extended family. because my mother is also a Tamimi, but they used to live in Beersheba. Now, try and convince my mother that she had no right to go back to the place she was born in. Try to convince millions of Palestinians like her. Of course, in 1948, their total number was about 750,000. But since 1948 until today, now you can count millions of Palestinians, the refugees and their descendants. Actually, most of the refugees, including my own mother, have passed away. But now their descendants, who count millions, haven't changed heart. Their eyes are still set on the houses their parents or their grandparents were driven out from, and the fields they were denied the right to return to. They want justice to be served to them. And if you talk about a two-state solution, it is as if you're saying to someone, we have an invading force. They came in, they took the house. But if you stop asking for your house back, we are willing to give you the shed. We are willing to give you the dog house on the side. We are willing to give you a little piece of the land to live on, without sovereignty, without independence, without self-determination, without any rights. Of course, that cannot be accepted. Try and offer this to anybody. Try and offer this to the people who support a two-state solution anywhere, whether in Europe or Malaysia or in the Arab countries. Nobody will accept this because it's just unjust. It's unfair. You cannot rob me of my property and then offer to share it with me. That's not acceptable. And that's why, despite the status quo, despite the real politics, despite what the world order insists on wanting to have in Palestine, the struggle continues. The struggle goes on. And I usually compare this to the struggles that preceded us. I mean, we are not really unique in this sense. The French occupied Algeria in 1830. And imagine, they left in 1961. It took them so long. And they not only occupied Algeria, they annexed it. Algeria at one stage was part of France. And they brought in their settlers from France. They established settlements for them. They empowered them to control the land. And the Algerians were treated as surplus humans. You can use them, you can make use of them if you need to, but they don't count. But the Algerian people continued to struggle, continued to resist. Yes, it took them 130 years or whatever, but eventually they liberated the land. Take the case of South Africa. The same thing. In South Africa, the white minority wanted to impose a system of discrimination, of racism, of apartheid, as they call it, on the majority indigenous population. They tried to come up with some sort of a realpolitik deal, like the Bantustans or something of this sort, or let's give you a little piece of bit of land here or there, or, and establish smaller kingdoms, and to appease probably the tribal heads or the tribal leaders. But the true strugglers, led by Nelson Mandela, insisted that there could be no settlement without an end to apartheid. And this takes me to my final point here, which is, what is the cause of the problem in Palestine? I mean, the cause of the problem in South Africa was apartheid, an ideology that said whites are considered by God his favorites. God told the whites, as they claimed in South Africa, that they could come from Holland or elsewhere in Europe and become owners of the land and enslave the blacks and just use them as a labor force without giving them any rights, without recognizing them as a people. Now, similarly, in Palestine, there was a movement that emerged in Europe called Zionism. And this movement tried to convince the Jews around the world that their plight in Europe and elsewhere could come to an end if they had a state of their own. Okay, where do we have a state of our own? Initially, they were in disagreement. Some of them thought that yes, of course, Jerusalem is holy, it's of religious relevance, but this is not the best place in the world to establish a viable state. Let's go to Argentina, some of them suggested. Some suggested probably if we can convince the Italians to give us Libya, then Libya is a much better place. Some thought of Mozambique, Uganda, whatever, even Cyprus. But eventually, the choice of Palestine was not actually their choice. The choice of Palestine was that of the European powers that were victorious in the First World War, and who were mostly ruled by politicians who espoused the ideology of Christian Zionism. Christian Zionists played a more important role actually in the establishment of the Jewish state in Palestine than the Jews themselves, because they believed that only when the Jews are sent back to Palestine that their own Messiah could come. And for the founders of Zionism, this was as silly as anything from their point of view that was mentioned in the Torah. So they didn't care. They only wanted their state. And this is what led to the acceptance in the Baal Conference of 1897 of the idea that Palestine should be the place where the Zionists should establish their homeland, or the Jewish homeland. And of course, the majority of the Jews were opposed to this. The majority of the Jews didn't agree with it because it contradicted what is mentioned, what is stated clearly in the Torah and in the Talmud, that they should wait for the Messiah to come before they contemplate returning to the promised land. But anyway, so the idea of Zionism is a very weird one, actually. And it's just amazing that the world is not paying enough attention, is not making enough effort to understand what Zionism stands for. Zionism started as a nationalist secular movement that empowers itself with the Torah. Imagine, I mean, someone who is an atheist, secular, but uses a holy book in order to justify his or her own project. It's just crazy. So they didn't believe in the Torah, they didn't believe in the prophets, they didn't believe in God, but they said, oh, we, the Jewish people, are entitled to this land because we are the chosen people of God, and God told us we have to return, and we are returning. They didn't believe in any of this, but they needed that discourse, they needed that rhetoric in order to convince a very reluctant, even resistant world Jewry to espouse their ideology and to support their project. Now, if you go to America today, or to France, or to Britain, or so many other countries that support Israel unconditionally sometimes, and try and promote the idea that someone comes to England and claims that we, the Tamimis, God gave us the right to come and take London from you. God gave us a license to come to Kuala Lumpur and claim it, or to go to Washington and claim it. They'll probably put us in a madhouse. It's crazy. They won't accept it. They only tolerate it when it comes to the Zionists. When the Zionists say this, nobody seems to question it. Not only that, they came up now with a new definition that if you criticize Zionism for its racism, you are considered to be an anti-Semite, and you could be prosecuted in some countries. It's just crazy, isn't it? But this is happening. So what's really, people who talk about two-state solution, whether it is a government in Egypt, or a government in the Gulf, or a government in Indonesia, or a government anywhere in the world, in Africa or in Asia, before they say we support a two-state solution, Let them go and read a little bit about what Zionism stands for. How can you accept a Zionist state anywhere in the world, not only in Palestine? I haven't yet spoken about what Palestine means to the Muslims, to us as Muslims. But if you accept a Zionist state that believes that the Jews are supreme, that they are better humans than any other human, that they have the right to kick my mother and her family out of their house and take the house and take my father's land and deny me the right to return to Palestine because God, as they claim, gave them that right, that is something you shouldn't accept anywhere in the globe and not just only in Palestine. So what I really urge people to do is to just go and search what Zionism is about. What do Zionists believe in? And if you don't have the time to read, just follow the news of what's going on in Palestine. Today, we have a government in Israel that is led by the so-called religious Zionism. It's a combination of two things. It's a combination of an idea which is originally nationalistic and secular, and all the claims and all the dogmas about God having given the Jews the right to the land, going back all the way to Nabiullah Ibrahim alayhi salam. Zionism is racism, and I recently attended a film review of the Tantura. I would encourage people to watch it if they haven't watched it. It's a documentary film about one of the massacres that were committed early in 1948 in a village called Tantura, overlooking the Mediterranean. And Professor Avi Shleim was one of the speakers after we watched the film together. And I put a question to him. I said to him, Professor Avi, and he's an Iraqi Jew. And by the way, he's just recently published his autobiography, which is magnificent. I'm currently reading it because next week I'm going to interview him for my TV channel. I said to him, you're associating racism of Israel to imperialism. You're saying that all imperialists are racists. What about Zionism? And he said to me, Zionism is racism. This was the position actually that was once adopted by the United Nations, until I regret to say that the Arabs who rushed to kiss the feet and the hands of the Zionists in order to win the heart of Washington caused the repeal of that the repealing of that resolution by the United Nations. Actually, Zionism is racism. So if you say, I accept a two-state solution, you accept a racist entity, a racist political entity that considers Arabs or non-Jews to be inferior, to even be worse than animals themselves. You accept the legitimacy of such an entity. And of course, we can talk at length, probably for a whole day, about what Palestine and Al-Quds in particular means to the Muslims. But probably we'll have to have that done on another occasion. I don't know if you've probably, I've been talking to more than half an hour or just about half an hour. Would you prefer that we stop here and probably have some discussion?
Okay, we can take a pause and then now the Oslo Accord. If you can explain to us, when they negotiated, when Yasser Arafat negotiated with the Israeli leaders recognizing Israel, does it also imply an acceptance of the two-state solution by the Palestinians? Can you elaborate on that?
Actually, in the Oslo Accords themselves, there is no mention, there is no talk of a Palestinian state. It is talk about stages. You continue to negotiate until you reach a permanent status. So they were talking about a permanent status. what permanent status is that? The PLO leaders who took that horrible decision tried to convince the Palestinians, the Arabs and the Muslims and the supporters of Palestine that this was conducive to a Palestinian state eventually. But actually, the Israelis never conceded officially to the establishment of a Palestinian state, although a Palestinian state stripped of sovereignty would indeed be of service to them. But they didn't believe in a Palestinian state right from the beginning. Oslo was an exchange of two things. Israel would recognize the PLO as the sole legitimate representative of the Palestinians in exchange for the PLO recognizing Israel's right to exist. So you see, Israel, according to the Oslo Accords, did not even recognize Palestinian rights. They only recognized the PLO as the sole legitimate representative of the Palestinians. Now, who the hell said that I, as a Palestinian, accept the PLO as my sole representative? Okay, they can be a representative at one stage when they are struggling for the cause, but once they give up on the cause, how can they continue to be representatives of any Palestinians? But of course, Israel now has a mandate, because the PLO is the sole legitimate representative of the Palestinians, and the Israelis are negotiating with that sole legitimate representative of the Palestinians. Then whatever is agreed upon becomes law, becomes a reality that everybody has to accept. And this is even a bigger Nakba than the Nakba of 1948, a bigger catastrophe than the catastrophe of 1948. And this, by the way, did not happen suddenly. It is regrettable that the PLO leadership much earlier, almost 20 years earlier, was actually paving the way for something like this. It goes all the way back to 1973, when the October War, or the Ramadan War as it is called sometimes, occurred, and the Egyptians initially managed to defeat the Israelis, but ended up being defeated a few days later. But then started a peace process with the Israelis that ended up with Sinai being quote unquote returned or liberated to the Egyptians, though demilitarized completely. There's an excellent book here that I would really strongly recommend. It's called The Good Spy. And in that book, the Good Spy is actually a former CIA senior official. His name is Robert Ames, and who was killed in the US embassy bombing in Beirut in the early 80s. Now, this book is his story. It's a story about him. A PhD student who knew him when he was a kid decided to do his PhD on him. Now, Robert Ames was the conduit between Yasser Arafat and the US government. And according to the documents the book reveals to us, as early as 1973, Yasser Arafat tried to convince the Americans to accept the principle of a Palestinian state anywhere, even in Jordan, that is east of the River Jordan, in exchange for the PLO recognizing Israel's right to exist in the whole of Palestine. And no wonder, a year later in 1974, the PLO, or the Fatah movement, which was the backbone of the PLO, came up with the 10 points plan in which they talk about a Palestinian state. The moment they talked about Palestinian state, everybody who knows politics really well at the time realized what was going on. These guys were going to pave the way for negotiating some sort of a peaceful settlement with the Israelis. And if you do this, you end up recognizing their right to exist on the land they stole earlier from the Palestinians. So Oslo was actually the end product of all these attempts that Israel earlier rejected and refused, but found itself needing it as a result of the Intifada, or the Palestinian uprising that started in 1987. And out of the womb of that Intifada was born the Islamic resistance movement, Hamas. And that was perceived as an existential threat at the time that drove the Israelis towards negotiating a peace settlement with Yasser Arafat, who equally felt threatened by the emergence of what many Palestinians thought at the time to be the alternative to the PLO.
All right. So, in other words, as non-Palestinians, and we look at the issue, so we can therefore say that the stance of the PLO shouldn't be taken as a stance of the Palestinians. And then we cannot fall into the trap of saying that is what the Palestinians want. We just say that was what the PLO wanted, but not necessarily what the Palestinians actually want. Is that how we can say it?
Definitely. See, somebody lied, and they want the entire world to believe that lie to be the truth. The PLO was never, ever a representative of the Palestinian people. From the day it was created, the PLO was created by the Arab League, not by the Palestinians. And the idea of creating the PLO was to tell the Palestinians, this is your issue, it's nothing to do with us. Whereas the issue of Palestine initially was seen as an Islamic issue. Because here, this is a part of the Muslim world that was part of the Khilafah for many centuries. And then these colonial powers managed to destroy the Caliphate and occupy the heart of the Arab world or the Muslim world, and want to create within it an alien entity to solve their own problem back home. So the PLO from day number one wasn't really a Palestinian project, but it was marketed as such. And when Yasser Arafat and a group of his colleagues created the Fatah movement, when they actually founded Fatah, they considered the PLO to be the enemy of the Palestinians. I mean, imagine people, if you go and read about the origins of the PLO, you'll find all of this written in documents. But people don't know about this because they assume, oh, the PLO is the Palestine Liberation Organization, so it must be Palestinian. Actually, Yasser Arafat condemned the PLO until he managed in 1968 to take over. And he was enabled to take over by the Arab regimes because they knew by then that he was going to be in line. How can they represent me or represent my mother if they are willing to give away our land and our property? I mean, look at Mahmoud Abbas. He is the chairman of the PLO. He is the head of the Palestinian Authority. He is the president of so many things. And he publicly on television said he doesn't aspire to have his family home in Safad back. He doesn't want it. That's Israel. I don't want anything from Israel. Even if you give up your own personal right, you have no right to give up or to concede the rights of millions of Palestinians. And I really regret that many people still consider the PLO something of value. It is of no value. It's a rotten edifice. And that's why I'm even angry with some of our own brothers in Palestine who, under pressure from regional powers, because they are under siege, they say, okay, yes, the PLO is the house of the Palestinians, but it needs tidying up. It needs to be cleansed. It needs to be put back in order. We need to be part of it. I mean, to hell with the PLO. The PLO doesn't represent me. We need to go back to the idea. What's the idea here? The idea is that we've been subjected to an invasion by an alien power, and that power is racist, is criminal, and we have to continue the struggle no matter what, with all means, until the world recognizes our rights in our homeland.
Okay. But countries, many Muslim countries, we have to name the countries, but many Arab, as you say, it's not many Muslim Arab countries continue to talk about, okay, we want to see justice of Palestinians, and then they go on to continue to say that they believe that the issue can be settled through the two-state solution. You highlighted that that is not going to be the case, but I want to understand, why do the leaders of these Muslim countries, Arab countries, okay, forget about America and Europe because they had the agenda to create Israel in the first place, but the Muslim countries, the Arab leaders, is it because they don't understand the issue, they do not know history, or what is the motive, the reason why they take up this stance? I want to can you please explain? This is politics, I suppose. Go ahead.
Well, if you talk about the Arab countries, if you talk about the Arab world, most of the countries in the Arab world are governed by people who don't represent their people. They don't represent them. They were never elected by them. They're not accountable to them. The rulers of Egypt, of Morocco, of Algeria, of the Gulf states, of any country, you name it. And that's why the Arabs rose in 2011 in what is known as the Arab Intifada, or the Arab Spring, because they wanted to regain their dignity, to regain their right to choose their leaders. These leaders don't represent them. And what these rulers do is what they see as appropriate in terms of their own interests as individuals or as individual states. So they have good relations with the world powers, the United States of America, Britain, France, whatever. So they go along and they say, okay, this is what the world community wants. Yes, we want justice for the Palestinians. But of course, absolute justice is impossible. Complete justice is impossible. So a little bit of justice is better than nothing. And there's nobody to question them. There's nobody to make them accountable for what they do. I am more critical of Muslim leaders or Arab leaders who are duly elected by their peoples. I mean, if we were to talk about an Arab country today, or a Muslim country that is outside the Arab world, in Africa or in Asia, if the majority of the people in that country are Muslim, and they elect a prime minister or a president, and that prime minister or president says, we stick to the international community's position on Palestine of settling for a two-state solution, then that prime minister or that president, though elected, in that particular issue doesn't represent the people he is ruling. Because if you were to ask the majority of the people, of the Muslim people around the world, they would want an end to Zionism. They would want to see Palestine returned to its people, free from occupation. And they really need to think about this. But of course, some of them see this as a secondary issue. And of course, I regret to say again that rulers or governments in Africa or Asia, even though they are in majority Muslim countries, they look at the Arabs and see the Arabs are hugging the Zionists, shaking their hands, normalizing relations with them, rather than boycotting Israel, encouraging Israeli products and Israeli tourism, etc. And they say, okay, we cannot be Arab than the Arabs. Ya akhi, you should adhere to the values, to the idea. The idea here is that we have a racist project, a project that demonizes the Muslims day and night. You need to understand this. You need to know the nature of Zionism and the entity Zionism created in Palestine. If you understand this very well, and if you are sincere and truthful, you'd never condone a two-state solution.
I think That is very, very clear indeed. Even though, unfortunately, as you said just now, many leaders talk about, still talking about this two-state solution, and and as it therefore means that they have sort of accepted Zionism, which is very sad. And I think I can only think that probably there are certain local politics at play here, or maybe they are a bit worried about the implication of having a stance that is different from the international community. Then they may affect trade with America or Europe or whatever. I am thinking that may be another reason why leaders of Muslim countries want to play safe. They want to take up a position that do not put them under pressure from international community or probably America. Probably, I think that may be the case because trade and economics, etc., may be affected once you are in the bad books of America. Maybe there is another possibility. I don't know. I'm just putting it to you whether you think that is the case, especially in Asia and Muslim Asia, countries in Asia.
I agree with you, and it is regrettable. But if they really try, instead of succumbing to American pressure or to Western pressure, if they try to come up with an alternative viewpoint, an alternative worldview. Yes, of course, in international relations, you need to deal with others, and you need to enter into some sort of compromising here and there, but not to the level where you concede on what you deep within you believe to be the truth. That's not right. And it is. I mean, politics is is not an easy road. People who enter into politics usually are prepared to make concessions and to sometimes step on the very values they spent many years of their lives upholding or defending or calling for. People like me and you who are activists or free academics, we can speak our mind, and we should continue to stand by what is right and what is just, no matter what. Eventually, the balance of power in the world will change, and these politicians, if they are still around, or whoever comes after them, will, inshallah, adopt the right position. Or we,
So,
both of us, and people like us, continue the struggle.
yeah, inshallah. So that's why when my son asked me to become a politician, I said, if I become a politician, I will change to a person and you will not like me. You will hate me. I said. So forget about me becoming a politician. I said, because I want to hold on to the right values and principles. Okay, so last words then, if you have any more to say, to give words of advice to people who are watching this, how should they move forward? Forget about talking about two-state solution then. Put it aside. Regardless of what the leaders of government say, that we have now established that shouldn't be the state. So what should we do now, in other words, to help Palestinians to obtain justice and freedom and equality that they deserve? Go ahead. What should we do?
I think the biggest challenge is to continue to bring up the issue and educate people about the origins of the conflict. Because many people may even emotionally express solidarity, but they don't really have the knowledge upon which they can base their support or their solidarity. So some of us need to educate themselves about the issue. And it's an important issue because, see, much of the trouble in our area, and sometimes it reaches your area, is because of the existence of such a racist, colonial, imperialist entity in our midst. education about this cause. And I would like to tell our brothers and sisters who
Oh, sorry. Yeah, I think the line is very bad over there in Jordan. I think. I hope he can join us back again.
are we back?
Yeah, we lost you for about 30 seconds. Can you repeat what you said just now? Oh.
Are we back now?
Yeah, I can see now. Can you please? We lost you for
Let me
about 30
just
seconds. Yeah.
by saying this. Let me just conclude by saying this. You see, the Palestinians have never given up. Yes, there's a group of them who are making concessions to the Israelis. They don't count as far as we are concerned. And you can see on your TV screens sometimes our young men and women who are standing in defense of Al Masjid Al Aqsa with nothing in their hands. So the struggle is continuing. And the Zionist entity is not in a good shape. They are moving from one crisis to another. So inshallah, the future is bright, and we need to just be patient and never give up. Things will happen and will happen soon. Changes are happening around the world, and hopefully very soon the Arabs will also rise again in a similar fashion to the intifada that they had more than 10 years ago, almost now 12 years ago. And therefore, people should never give up on the Palestinian cause. To the contrary, there's every reason for us to continue the work, to continue the struggle, and to find means of reaching out to the rest of the world.
Thank you very much for that very optimistic note on the optimistic words. I think these are really needed. And of course, what you said just now is that everybody should try to understand the origin of the injustice in Palestine. Without understanding the origin, we may be swayed by what's the so-called reality of what's happening now, and not having not holding on to the principle of justice, which is very important in this world now. So thank you again, Dr. Azzam. Inshallah, hope one day we can invite you over to Kuala Lumpur and give a talk.
Well, thank you for having me today. Thank you very much. Thank you.
It's a pleasure to all of us. Thank you. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh, and Eid Mubarak again to you.
Alaikum salam. Eid Mubarak to you and to all brothers and sisters.
Okay.
Yamanillah.
Bye-bye. Thank you.